What's up guys, it's Bo here again, and welcome to another Bo Junior vlog. It's really warm today, great day. Today I thought I'd break away from, because recently, if you've watched any of my recent videos, I've been talking more from a kind of practical viewpoint on, things like being brave, pursuing a life that you truly want, pursuing a life of freedom. Things like that, of that nature. And today I thought I'd go back to, the kind of tone of some of my earlier videos and talk about something a bit bigger, talk about something a bit more out there, right? So I thought today I'd talk about something I mentioned actually in a previous entry, which is, I mentioned this idea that humanity is a pitfall species, right? And that, as I said in that video, it isn't actually my own concept. It is something that Teal Swan, the spiritual teacher, came up with in describing how humanity is with and their kind of problems in this modern society we live in. But I also kind of want to talk in the kind of direction of where we are headed, right? Because there is a massive question, particularly in the kind of new agey spiritual community, in terms of what's going to happen to humanity, right? Because in many ways, humanity has seen itself flourish over the years. And it's like, it's the obvious question of like, where do we go from here, right? We live in this amazing society. Science and, technological kind of advancements would, very much like us to believe that, humanity is just going to keep getting better. Maybe one day we'll live in space or something. But I have my own kind of theory, based on what I have been thinking about and also what other teachers and kind of intellectuals, the intelligentsia of the past, both the past and, the present, have basically talked about, right? So I'll go into that, but first I want to talk about this pitfall idea, right? So in previous entries I've talked about how we have these two processes, these two observable and, subjectively identifiable processes of logic and emotion, right? I've done several videos kind of going into a bit of depth as to, how they are different, their strengths and weaknesses, and that kind of thing, right? And basically humanity very much identifies itself as being an intelligent species, right? Intelligence is basically the it is the kind of traits that we've come to identify ourselves with in relation to other species, right? So like our species is the first species that we know of that is intelligent in the sense of, being able to be self-aware, to communicate verbally and otherwise, through language and art and things like that. And be able to kind of build and manipulate our surroundings in such a way that is very kind of, intricate and sophisticated, right, by our definition. But, right, there is a growing, and this hasn't quite reached kind of the mainstream consciousness yet, like the global consciousness, but there is kind of this growing awareness within humanity that perhaps we have become a bit kind of, what's the word? A bit kind of overly arrogant, I guess you could say, like overly confident in our abilities to be, to be intelligent and all of those things, right? Because, although there is, like I've said in previous entries, there are the obvious benefits of being an intelligent species, right? We pretty much, we bitch about our society a lot, and I do it, But, we find ourselves in a society that's, unprecedented in history on the earth, at least, It's like no one really, unless you live in, like, unfortunate circumstances, like the average person who lives in this kind of society is very much sheltered, They don't have many worries, a lot of, like, we live in relative security, right? In direct contrast with how we used to live in, like, you know, a more ancient world, right? But basically what has happened now is that ultimately we have basically become overly identified with that, right? And to use another one of Teal Swan's concepts, like she likes to refer to our age right now as the emotional dark age, right? Because of our over-identification with, you know, our intelligence, you know, our thinking mind, to such a degree, to such a degree that we have basically lost the essential kind of, you know, the more essential intelligence, which is, you know, feeling, right? And has ultimately become subjugated to our thinking, right? And so the pitfall that comes with the ability to be self-aware to the degree that we are, and to be able to analyze things to the degree that we can, is that we become very much attached to our mental kind of conclusions, our mental associations, and that kind of thing, right? Because like I mentioned in the third entry in my Logic v Emotion kind of mini-series, is that logic is kind of like a snapshot process, right? So logic works it works by taking a state of energy. So, you know, whether that be through our senses or, you know, just via intuition, like we take these snapshots of how reality is, you know, under certain conditions, and like we kind of piece them together, and that's how logic works, right? We build these kind of mental structures that help us to basically make sense of and kind of navigate our environment and navigate nature, right? But if we become overly attached to that process, right, it becomes such that we start to become those kind of structures and perceptions become fixed, right? And as I said also in that entry, the true nature, the most fundamental kind of aspect of nature is energy, right? So, you know, existence is ultimately energy in motion, right? It is this kind of constant ebb and flow of energy, right? And logic works by taking snapshots of that kind of flowing energy and kind of building upon it so that we can manipulate nature in certain ways, right? But ultimately, it is moving, right? And it is very easy for us to fall into the trap, right? Into the pitfall of holding on to these mental associations and becoming numb to the continuing progress of energy in nature, right? So how does this manifest, right? This manifests in basically very self-destructive behavior in society, like basically human beings doing things that hurt other human beings and themselves, right? You know, it keeps us basically in our own mental prisons, right? You know, because yeah, you know, we live in a very kind of fucking amazing time right now. You know, we can drive cars, we can talk into cameras, and this will be transmitted to like potentially, you know, millions of people around the world, you know, maybe one day. And it's amazing, right? But like at the same time, you know, like I identify with, like I've identified in the previous entries, you know, we find ourselves very much trapped. You know, the feeling that we have, the default feeling that we have is very trapped, very fearful, very anxious. You know, feeling like we're not actually alive, you know, all of these things that come with an insensitivity to energy, right? And that is ultimately because we've over-identified with the mind, right? Yes, because, you know, the mind is amazing, right? But the way that the mind works is that it can fool itself, right? It's like, the thing is, like, you know, we like to think that we have nature fooled, right? By, you know, by doing all of this amazing stuff, right? But the thing with the mind is that it can, as much as it is advantageous, if it believes that what it does is advantageous to itself, it also takes advantage of itself, if that makes sense, right? So, to give you a bit of an example, this is a thought that I had recently. So, you know, I've been saying that, you know, self-awareness is a very important thing, and a lot of self-help, personal development, spirituality teachers would also, you know, say things along those lines. You know, the self-awareness is ultimately, you know, something that's very important to your self-actualization and your happiness in life. But self-awareness can also be a pitfall, right? And this is ultimately the thing, what myself and Teal mean by, humanity's pitfall species, right? Because we're so self-aware and identified with, that awareness, which is, a mental thing. We can also deceive ourselves, right? We can buy so much into that we forget that, like, the bigger picture of things, the actual nature of things. So, as an example, I am someone who is very passive, right? I've done entries about this in the past, and, I'm at a point of life where I'm trying to fight against it, but, like, there are situations in life that make me feel, that constantly remind me that, I'm a very powerless person. I can be timid in certain situations, and I always struggle with conflict and confrontations with other people, even if it means, like, me having to forego, like, my own desires, my own values sometimes. But I'm constantly fighting towards that even now. But then I had a revelation the other day, which is that like, at which point, because I was like, wait a minute. Like, I've been fighting against this for so long, right? I've been fighting against, like, it's just like, this dialogue has been playing in my head for so long. Like, I can't even remember when it was installed, but it's like, this dialogue that, Boris, you are weak, you are timid, you are overly nice, you don't like competition, you don't like to rock the boat, you don't like to challenge, and it's like, this dialogue, and I noticed this dialogue, like, for the first time in this kind of, I was able to observe it for the first time, and I was like, when did that start playing in my head, right? And then I went back to, like, my upbringing and stuff like that, and it's like, I started to ask the question, this was the big crunch, right? Am I actually someone who is timid, right? Am I actually someone who is overly nice and does not like challenge? Because also, like, the reason that I kept fighting against this is because, I recognize, at least logically, right, that, like, in order to be successful in life, in order to kind of get to where you want to get to, there is an element of challenge to it, right? You have to kind of step up and be brave, right? I did entries about this, you have to be brave in order to succeed. And so I was like, well, I'm not brave. I have this internal dialogue that says, I'm not brave, and therefore I will not get to the point where I can be brave, or, like, that I can enjoy the chaos, right? This was, the exact words I used. Like, I'm someone who cannot enjoy the chaos because the chaos is scary and I'm a coward, right? And for the very first time, I asked myself, well, what if I wasn't that, right? And this is like a huge paradigm shift. It's like, what if actually this identity of myself being a timid person is actually something that I mentally constructed? Because, like, ultimately, like, this makes sense, right? No one can ultimately brainwash you unless you let them to some degree. And so, at some point, to some extent, I must have let the external, like, people in my life, make me believe, and, I ultimately bought into it, that, like, I'm a coward, right? That I don't enjoy, like, challenge, I'm timid, I'm unambitious, I'm lazy, all of these things, right? All of these self-defeating thoughts. And it's like, what if I actually could become someone like that? And basically, I went down that path, and it's like, ultimately, it's like this whole kind of reversal of how I perceive myself. So, like, I have this additional perspective now. But, like, the point is, like, from telling you this is that a lot of the times, the things that we fight against, in our minds, are actually things that we installed into ourselves. So they're actually things that we made, and yet we fight against, it, right? So it's kind of like the autoimmune response, right? When the body attacks itself, it's a similar thing, where you made something, right? You've kind of forgotten that you made it, or at least you made it subconsciously, so you didn't consciously make that thing, but you did make it, right? And you consciously fight against that, and you weaken yourself in that way, right? Such that you basically you're fighting against yourself. And, like, when you think about it like that, it's like, it's kind of dumb, right? Like, as much as it is true, like, it is also kind of dumb, like, you're the one who's fighting against yourself, right? You thought that this thing was, like, just an inherent part of you, and thus nothing really, something that you had no choice over, right? But actually, you did create it, right? Even though it wasn't conscious, you created it, right? And the logical mind basically attacks that, right, consciously, and like you get this kind of very self-defeating, like it's like the way I like to describe it, I call this kind of thing brake pedaling, where you are basically, you have one foot on the brake and you have one foot down on the throttle, on the gas, on the accelerator. So you're basically stuck, but you're wasting your own energy, right? And this is only one example of, like, you know, how we get into these traps. But like basically, the mind likes judgment, right? The thing with the mind is it judges, right? And you know, I talked about subjective morality before, but like we see if it's still recording. We tend to make judgments on things in terms of good and bad, right? So we like to think of certain things as good for us, or certain things that are good, and certain things that are bad, right? But the truth of of this existence is that nothing is inherently good or bad, right? If you really go down to the very core of it, it is rather that those things are good or bad relative to where we are energetically, right? That is the truth of, you know, the kind of interaction of energy in our universe, right? Things are good to us when we are in the right kind of energetic space. You know, spiritual people like to call it vibrational frequency. When we're in the right vibrational frequency for that thing to then catapult us into a higher vibrational frequency, you know, so to speak. But as I said, you know, the mind is a grasping tool. You know, the mind takes snapshots, and so we could get to a higher vibrational frequency, but still be attached to that same idea that this thing is good for us or that this thing is bad for us, right? So conversely, we can also drop to a level where we are still judging that this thing is bad, right? But actually, from our energetic set point, that thing would actually be good for us. You know, an example of this would be, you know, this is basically how emotions work, right? You have negative emotions because this is your body's response to try and get you into a better energetic space or a higher vibrational frequency. But like, since we have judged in society that negative emotion is wrong, then we suppress that, and this then triggers that self-attacking paradigm where the body attacks itself for something that it's subconsciously doing to protect itself. So you're trying to consciously undo something that you have judged as good by your mind because of, you know, the snapshot, but it is actually something that you have subconsciously created in order to make yourself feel better, and so you're basically attacking yourself, and it's fucking bullshit, right? But you know, that is another example. So, and the judging thing, it's like, the way that the universe works is like, yes, there is polarity, right? The conscious mind and the logical mind sees polarity, right? It sees light and dark. It sees hot and cold. It sees attractive and not attractive. It sees strong and weak, right? But the way that the universe actually works is that this polarity reflects, right? So whatever happens in reality, I'm giving you so many kind of insights here, but there is this thing called, again, it's another teal swan kind of a concept, but it's the law of mirroring, right? So so basically, when we want to get somewhere, right, because our own kind of it is our own kind of individual desire, right? So as a person, you want to do something because it will benefit you or it'll make you feel good. Simultaneously, you know, so basically you can say that, like, you bear with me because this is a bit unrelated, but I thought I'd give you this anyway. So if for example you want to become a better person, you want to be a kind of a good person, you know, a person who contributes to society, who has a positive impact on the world, and you want to get your life together for that purpose, because you want to feel good, and also because, yeah, you ultimately want to feel good, you want to feel accomplished, right? And simultaneously, right, by undergoing that process, the world, so the collective consciousness, the collective humanity that we live in, I don't know if I'm making the right point here actually, but like, I might actually abandon this, but like, basically like, by you doing the action, you will feel good, right? It's a bit, yeah, so it's a bit kind of cyclical, but like ultimately like the second part of that statement of like, I want to become better, in order to feel good, right? The action of doing so will make you feel good, if that makes sense. So like basically, as much as you are pushing to feel good, the outcome is pulling you to feel good. So like, and we tend to think of one or the other, right? But anyway, going back to what I'm actually supposed to be talking about. So another pitfall is that like we like to think of certain things as really good or really bad, right? But the thing is that the better that something is, or the worse that something is, right? The opposite kind of extent in terms of polarity is also true, right? So basically, something that is a very amazing tool, right, or you know that's really really good, can also be very fucking bad, right? And this is something that's very hard to see if it's something that's very universally lauded, or that's, you know, yeah, so where there's lots of evidence, like, you know, physical evidence to the fact that, you know, it is a good thing, right? So for example, you know, like, even this kind of thing, you know, like motivational videos and things like that, they're very good, but they also have the pitfall of basically making you, they can either make you feel crappy, because like there will come a point where like these motivational videos will stop working for you. Like if you make it such that like if you attach yourself to like, you know, using these motivational videos to get you to improve, right? The same works with any kind of ritual, right? The more that you invest into it, and as the value continues to diminish, like the crappy you feel about yourself, right? Because you're like, this should be working, but it's not working for me anymore, right? And it can also, from the point of being a very amazing motivator, it can then swing to the very opposite and become like a fucking terrible demotivator, right? And like the greatest pain, you know, using like an example of the opposite direction, you know, people who have been through like fucking terrible shit, right? They're one of the, like, they tend to become one of the most switched on, enlightened, compassionate people, right? You would think logically that like these kinds of people would be like, you know, basically like psychopaths because they've been through like such fucking terrible shit. You know, it's like Teal Swan is one of them, right? She went through like a really terrible, abusive, you know, something that really sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? And she is one of those people who are doing like real change work, right? So your greatest tool can become your greatest crutch, right? And your greatest downfall can become your greatest strength, right? So this is the pitfall of humanity, right? We tend to kind of overly attach on one side of the spectrum and completely miss the other side, right? So anyway, moving on to the evolution of humanity, right? This is kind of one thing that is inhibited by that, actually. You see, because you listen to the work of Eckhart Tolle, right? He's the dude who talks about the power of now, where basically he talks about the mind and its enslaving of you, right? The mind enslaves, right? And I've talked about this in previous videos, but basically, I'm going to try and make this a bit shorter because like I kind of need to go and like it's dragging on a bit, but basically I can talk about this at length also in a future video, but humanity is something that we are, right? We are humans, but we are also not human, right? So one other thing, you know, I'm chucking another concept at you today, is that reality is multidimensional, right? And what does this mean? This means that basically what is true at one level is different on another level, or does not apply to another level, right? So an example of this is that like is how you identify yourself, right? You could identify yourself as a person because you are a person, but you could also identify with the whole of humanity. You could identify with you know, something that is beyond human. And you could even go to the extent of identifying yourself with everything in existence. So like this is when you reach source, God, oneness, you know, whatever you want to call it, right? And basically, evolution is this kind of movement of form, right? So Eckhart Tolle also talks about the world of form and like, you know, people like Alan Watts and people like that, right? which is basically form refers to, you know, like physicality, right? And physicality is, it exists, right? You know, look at me, you know, look at you, you know, I don't have to say that it doesn't exist, like, because some people do tend to say, like, it, you know, there are things in Buddhism, for example, like, I'm not slating Buddhism, but, like, it can be misinterpreted to mean that, like, all form is an illusion. And it is, you know, this is an example also of multidimensionality. Like, on one level, it is an illusion because it's temporal, right? It is temporary. It will disappear at one point. All form, whether it is, you know, your body or your thinking, your thoughts, you know, ideas, identities, they will eventually be eradicated and be replaced by new form, right? So on one level, it is an illusion, but on another level, it is real, you know, like, this is real. But in terms of evolution, right, we have to kind of step outside of our temporal perspective, our human perspective, and into, you know, a higher perspective, right? So we have to disidentify with our identity as a human being, right? Because, again, on one level, we are human, but once you start to question, you will realize that actually, on a higher level, we're not necessarily human, right? And basically, if you get to the level where you identify with life as a whole, so not just humanity, so you're thinking of yourself as under the same kind of blanket as all other life in the universe, right? Then you'll realize that, okay, so you take so let's say that, you know, humanity is a car, right? That car, like, you know, let's say that humanity is a certain type of car and that, like, you know, another species of animal is another type of car, right? You know, like, in terms of like the quality of car, right? You know, like, it doesn't matter necessarily what happens to an individual type of car, as long as, like, the kind of standard of car improves, right? So this is kind of a strange analogy, but, like, basically, if you kind of view humanity as like a type of organism, right? So at this level of thinking, that we're a type, you know, we are life, but we're a type of life, right? And basically, at some point, this type of life is going to change, right? Which means that humanity as we know is going to end, right? And if you're identified with the human perspective, like, you're like, fuck! You're like, fuck! Like, oh, fucking hell, no way! Like, no fucking way, like, right? But on another level, once you've disidentified, once you've kind of moved higher on, you realize that all life, if you are part of all life, then it just means that the life that will spring forth from within you, from this point in time, even if humanity is to become extinct, right? Like, you know, new, better life will replace it, right? So, and, you know, again, I'll go into this in more depth in future entries. Like, I just thought this would be a good extension to, like, the topic that I had for this video. But, yes, so basically, like, we then start to get into, like, you know, reincarnation. You know, what is reincarnation? You know, do we live on? And actually, my belief is that we do. You know, I won't live on as Boris, but I will become a new form of life at some point. Like, my consciousness is consciousness, right? Consciousness will become, whether or not that is me, you know, Boris, whether or not I will like the same things, you know, like, consciousness is still consciousness, so, like, new life will come, right? And if that is so, you know, if life is eternal, then, like, wouldn't you want the life that comes forth from the future to be good, right? Because, like, when we identify with humanity, right, there's the tendency of basically, like, thinking, like, oh shit, you know, like, fuck it. If like, if humanity's gonna be extinct, then fuck it anyway. Like, I don't give a fuck, right? But, like, actually, like, if you start to think in terms of, like, humanity as part of life as a whole, wouldn't you want the life that progresses from here to be, like, fucking amazing, like, and keep progressing to be better and better? And that's ultimately, you know, I'm gonna end with this. That is ultimately the point of existence, the point of life. It's this continual moving towards, like, a better life, you know, for future generations, right? You know, that is why evolution happens, you know. You know, from a scientific perspective, that's true, and from a spiritual perspective, that is also true, like, when you really think about it intuitively. But anyway, that is my entry. Like, it's been a long entry, I need to go, because I'm late for work. But yeah, so I hope that's been insightful. It's not been the most practical entry, but again, you know, I wanted to do something a bit more highbrow this time, I was kind of in the mood for it, so cool. I hope that kind of stirred your brain a bit, and I will catch you guys in the next entry. Peace out.